We're in Matthew chapter 14. Have a Bible or a device and open it there with me. We left off last week in verse 13 as we had seen that John the Baptist had been executed, murdered at the hand of Herod Antipas there as we looked at that. In verse 13 of chapter 14 here we read, when Jesus heard it, talking about the death of John, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. So understand that as we are looking at this, what had happened was John had publicly spoken against Herod's marriage to Herodias, his brother, his half-brother Philip's wife. She was an evil woman, and as a result of his outspoken attitude about their godless marriage, wanted to have John executed from the start. Both she and Herod, they'd wanted to get rid of John straight away. However, Herod, we're told, fearing the people, threw John in prison instead. He was also afraid that Rome would find his handling of the matter untimely because he was already at war with a neighboring nation as a result. So now, months later, it was Herod's birthday. Everybody who was anybody was invited to the party. Now, Herodias' daughter, Salome, she was a young girl, probably not more than 14 years old, had been invited to dance for the king. Now, impressed by her performance, in his drunken arrogance, wanting to show off his power and his influence to his buddies, Herod had foolishly invited her to ask anything she wanted of him, and it would be given. So Herodias, seizing the opportunity now to hem her husband in, had told Salome to ask for the head of John the Baptist. Not only that, but to ask for it to be delivered to the party on a plate, on a platter. So we saw in verse 9 last time that the king was sorry. We looked at that. In Mark chapter 6, we saw that he was exceedingly sorry, but not sorry enough to reverse course. So to save face, again with his friends, Herod had ordered John executed and for his head to be delivered to the party as promised, to Salome, and then on to her mother as requested so. Finally, last week we looked at the disciples of John. They took a great risk to themselves when they went and they retrieved the Baptist body and went and buried it. It was at that time that they went and told Jesus. His response would be to withdraw from the crowds, to get alone to grieve for John. Also, he would withdraw to spend time with his men as they were returning from their first solo mission. Remember, earlier in the gospel, we see that Jesus sent his men out. As we blend the gospels here, we see that his men are coming back right at this time. Interesting to note, in this section of Matthew 14 that we're looking at this morning, is other than the resurrection, the feeding of the 5,000 that Jesus did, that miracle is recorded for us in all four of the gospel accounts. Interesting, Charles Spurgeon said this, he said, quote, all four of the gospel writers record it, so none of us will ever forget how much the Lord can do with little things that are yielded to him. And we're going to talk about that more as we go this morning. What that means, though, is that this is a very important, very significant passage in which, as we allow God's Spirit to come in to teach us, there are important lessons for each of us to learn. This is a passage that is rich in personal application, and we're going to touch on that as we go. With that, we're going to attempt again to blend the four accounts together. I had a great time preparing for this. I told someone I think I spent probably twice the amount of time I normally do. I mean, I started like last Tuesday because I wanted to be able to try to get the chronology of all of this. And there's a lot of moving parts when you have all four Gospels having different points of view of the same event. So we're going to look at all of those. We're going to blend them together this morning, or at least try to stitch them together. At the same time that these things were taking place, remember, Jesus had commissioned and enabled his men and sent them out. He personally empowered them to go to the different cities throughout the region of Galilee and to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom. They were out doing miracles, performing signs and wonders themselves. So as we look at Mark's gospel, he brings these things together. There we see that Mark brings together Jesus or John's disciples coming to bury his body, Jesus' men returning, and he also talks about Jesus' need to withdraw, as he tells us in Mark chapter 6, verse 30. He says, the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they didn't even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves. But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him. So, as we put these accounts together, we learn that at the time that Jesus took his disciples with him as they got into a boat and departed to what they refer to as a deserted place. And the reason for that is, again, Jesus was troubled over the death of John, grieving. Also, his death at Herod's hand was proof that the threat of persecution, the mounting tension between him and the religious leaders and him and the governing leaders, was growing significantly at this point, intensifying. Plus, he and his men, they just simply needed a break. Sometimes it's no more complicated than that. They needed to rest. They're exhausted. So Jesus desires to get alone for a period of time with the 12. All of them, again, needed a break. So Jesus took the lead as they looked to find a deserted place where they could rest, someplace out of the way, where what's implied, a deserted place where the people aren't going to track them down. That doesn't happen. Understand there's much debate as to just where this place is. And I'm going to talk about that. And I'm not going to claim that I know exactly where, but I think it's beneficial for us to reconcile all four Gospels together as we work through that question. Where did they go? What was the deserted place they went to? Now, Matthew doesn't tell us the location. Luke informs us that they sailed toward a little village named Bethsaida, and many people believe that that's where this was. We'll get to that as we go. There's considerable debate about Bethsaida being the location where they went, because one thought is it was the little village known as Bethsaida Julius, which was located east of Capernaum on the other side of the Jordan River. It was on the east side, north of where the Jordan River flows into the Sea of Galilee, sort of on the delta there. I've got a map here, a slide, showing the Sea of Galilee. You see Capernaum, I have that in bold print at the top. Now you see to the right of that is Bethsaida Julius, and we'll talk about why I don't believe that that's the place in a minute. But working our way around the map, you see I have a question mark under Bethsaida of Galilee there, because somewhere between Magdala and Capernaum, there are archaeological ruins that have been identified as a small settlement there. And it's presumed that that could have been another, and it was common for them to have different cities with the same name in that day, especially here. One of them is in Gentile territory because Bethsaida Julius is across the river. That's Gentile territory. One of them is in Jewish territory. Here, if there's a Bethsaida on the northwestern shore of the lake, that would be in Jewish territory. Now, underneath that, you see Magdala. That's where Mary Magdalene came from. That's why she gets her name. Underneath that is a place called Mount Arbel. Between that and then down to the south of that is Tiberias. We're going to talk about that as we go. So I just want you to locate in your mind the different places that we see as these events unfold here on the Sea of Galilee. Now, I personally question whether it's the Bethsaida that Luke is referring to, because after feeding the 5,000, John, in chapter 6 of his gospel, tells us in verse 17, they got into a boat and went over the sea toward Capernaum. Now, if it's that Bethsaida, it's not very far. And we know that later, after these things unfold, that they get in the boat and they are caught in a huge storm in the middle of the lake while they're crossing over the lake, we're told. And so in order to do that, I mean, here from Bethsaida to Capernaum, It would be a short sail. It would be kind of hugging the coastline. So that, to me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Might have been. I mean, the winds they blew very strong in that region. Could have blown them out in the middle of the lake. That's possible. So we're going to see in our next study that, again, they get caught in this storm, and that's when Jesus comes walking towards them on the water. They think he's a ghost and all of that. Well, that's a great passage. I'm looking forward to teaching that next time around. But I want to give you one solution, because early Christian writers, as well as archaeological evidence, talk about two Bethsaidas. The one here, Bethsaida Julius, east of Capernaum, on the other side of the river. The other one, Bethsaida of Galilee, was likely somewhere, again, on the northwestern shore of the lake, north of Tiberias. And Tiberias is important. We'll get to that in a minute. If that's the case, and I want to, total disclaimer here, we are way into interpretation, all right? This may or may not be the case. As we blend these four Gospels, though, there are some plausible things that come about. We'll talk about that as we go. But as we look at this, then all four Gospels, if there are two Bethsaidas, then all four Gospels actually harmonize together. It fits the description of the location. So we also need to understand the scale here. The Sea of Galilee is actually a large lake. It's roughly 7 miles wide and 13 miles long. It is not a sea in the classical sense that we think of a sea as a vast body of water, like going out on the sea. They called it that, but it really is sort of a medium-sized, a larger-sized lake. So as we look at this, we see that John also tells us in chapter 6 that the location of the feeding of the 5,000 was near the city of Tiberias, which is on the western shore of the lake. In John 6:23, we read this. He says, however, other boats came from Tiberias, and then he says, near the place where they ate bread after the Lord had given thanks. It's a clear reference to the feeding of the 5,000. So that raises another question. If Jesus was somewhere along the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, he'd need to find a place that would be suitable to hold 15,000 people. Now, understand, the Sea of Galilee sits in a bowl, all right? It's surrounded with rocky hills and mountains that come right up to the edge of the lake along its coastline. And there are not very many places. I've been through the land, been out on the Sea of Galilee. There are not a lot of places where you could land a boat and put that many people. So John tells us they would need to accommodate, again, it's 5,000 men. Which means probably 15, perhaps north of 15,000 people. So one place that makes sense to me, and understand again, nobody's going to lose their salvation if I'm wrong, okay? I want to be clear on that, is that Jesus feeding the 5,000 was on the southern flanks of a place called Mount Arbel. And this, again, I say that because I believe it fits. Now I have a series of slides here. And this first one, these are called the Cliffs of Arbel. They're on the very northern edge of Mount Arbel. Now you're thinking, okay, how are you going to get 15,000 people up there? Well, notice also Capernaum off in the distance, just to kind of give you an idea of the distance. And the perspective is a little strange here. I mean, it's not that far, but it's far enough that they could easily have gotten into the lake and gotten into a mess there. The point is, these cliffs are on the edge, the northern edge of a mountain that slopes gently all the way to the sea. So the next slide would be if you climbed up onto those rocks and you look south, this is what you'd see. You'd see where I have the dotted area there on the bottom. That's right about where Mount Arbel slopes down to the sea. Much green grass in that place, as John tells us. Again, possibly the place, may not be, but I think it's plausible. The next slide shows if you were down on the bottom looking back up at Mount Arbel, you see the slope of Mount Arbel there. And this is on the highway that's between Tiberias and Mount Arbel as you're looking up. I went on Google Maps and actually did a screenshot of this. But notice to the left, there's that area that's, again, it's gently sloping. It would easily accommodate a crowd this size. So the next slide shows if you're in Capernaum, looking over at Mount Arbel. So again, just to give you scale, to give you an understanding that these are places within line of sight of one another. So in Capernaum, looking over at Mount Arbel, you see the big cliff off in the background. Now turn that around. Let's say you're standing on the edge of Mount Arbel. In the next slide, you see the rocks in the foreground that's right on the cliff. I have a picture that was taken of me standing, or sitting actually, on the cliffs of Arbel one time. It didn't work out for me to show it here, but it's an amazing, gorgeous view. I mean, Jesus, we're told that after these events, he sends the crowd home, he sends his disciples out in the lake, and it says he went up on the mountain to pray. And what a view he would have had, watching his guys strain against the oars perhaps, or whatever. But truly, it's a beautiful place. Again, seeing Capernaum off in the distance, this is what it would look like from Mount Arbel, from the top of Mount Arbel. Don't know, again, totally in interpretation here, looking at, trying to blend these four gospel accounts together. This is very plausible, if not the place. It could have been the other Bethsaida. We don't know. Regardless of which direction Jesus went, regardless of the location, whether it was Bethsaida, Julius, or Arbel, north of Tiberias, we do know that he got into a boat with his disciples. We also learn that the crowd saw him leave. It didn't take long for them to figure out where they were headed, regardless of what their location ended up being. So think about it here with me, folks. Envision Jesus in the boat with his disciples. Perhaps he's still kind of distant, distracted, because his mind is still upon his cousin John and the fresh report of his death. And they're out there heading across the lake. Mark tells us that the people on the shore saw the direction he was going, and they ran from the villages all over the region toward the sea, toward the area in the sea where they believed that Jesus was headed. And they got there ahead of him. Now, Luke and John both add that as Jesus and his men got off the boat, began to go up onto the mountain overlooking the Sea of Galilee, they almost immediately encountered the multitude that was there waiting for them, and then another group joining them. In Luke chapter 9, verse 11, we read, "But when the multitudes knew it, they followed him, and he received them." That's significant. And he spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who had need of healing. So think about it. Jesus received them. Let's look at this for a minute. I think that this is fascinating because John gives us a very interesting insight, one that we do well to think through, because it ties to what we're looking at this morning in this study. So there we see the Apostle John in the Gospel of John writes the following in John chapter 6, verse 2. He says, "Then a great multitude followed him because they saw the signs which he performed on those who were diseased." So they followed John. Why? Because they saw his miracles. That's why they were following him. It was their priority. They wanted relief from their circumstances. In other words, the majority followed him for what he could do for them physically. And we'll see that again in our next study, because Jesus is very direct with them when he essentially, they follow him, they chase him around the lake again after this. And he's very direct with them when he says, look, if you want anything to do with me, you have to eat my body and drink my blood, which would be about the most stumbling thing you could say to a Jew. Get to that later. I could rabbit trail on that and go. The point is, he sees that these people have ill-gotten motives. They have the wrong motives as what he's doing. And we'll talk about that more as we go through this. But they're there for physical relief. It tells us that most of them in the crowd had little concern for the healing of their souls from the disease of sin. They're there for a physical benefit, not for a spiritual one. And that leads us to the text that we're looking at this morning in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 14, verse 14. And when Jesus went out, remember, Luke says that he received them, he saw a great multitude. That means a huge crowd. And he was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. Folks, I'm a visual person. This is a remarkable, remarkable scene. as we understand that Jesus was exhausted, his disciples, they're exhausted. Also that Jesus was fully aware that most of these people showed up simply for what they could get from him physically instead of looking for what he could do for them spiritually. Even in all of that, he was still moved with compassion for them. Now, the Greek word for compassion is a very, very strong word. What it indicates is it's the same word that's used for bowels or for guts. What he's saying is that Jesus looks out over this multitude and he has a visceral reaction. It's something from deep within him as he looks out and he sees them. We're told in another gospel that he looked out at the crowds and he had compassion because they were as sheep without a shepherd. John Corson, in his commentary, he says this, quote, he says, "How do I know when it's time to plunge in and get involved versus when it's time to retreat and be quiet before the Lord?" He goes on to say, "I believe the answer lies in this passage. As with Jesus, compassion within you and anointing upon you are good indicators that you need to get involved in the situation around you." And I think that that's good. Here we see that anointing and compassion combine together in Jesus, and they make it absolutely impossible for him to do anything but dive in and help, even though he's exhausted, even though he was trying to find a place to get alone with his men. So consider with me for a moment what would be going on in this multitude, this crowd of people. Certainly we'd find among them those who were sick, afflicted, those who were tormented, perhaps mentally. We find no doubt there would be those who were demon-possessed, lepers who dared to make their way to Jesus, if possible, paralytics, men, women, children, old, young, people from every class, every walk of life, all there. Essentially, it could be said that here we see the unwashed masses of humanity, with all of their illnesses, all of their needs, all of their messiness, making their way to Jesus. And his response was visceral. He was deeply moved with compassion. Compassionately, patiently, tirelessly, with utmost care, taking time for each one. As exhausted as he was, Jesus loved them. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. What insight into the nature of God, the one that we love. Insight into his character, his mercy, his grace, his willingness to receive us. In 1 John 4:19, John, the apostle, late in his life, writes this. He says, "We love him because he first loved us." Verse 15, "When it was evening, his disciples came to him saying, 'This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food.'" So we don't know exactly what time of day it was. We know that for the Jews, twilight, they called twilight, that was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So chances are good this is somewhere between 3 and 6 p.m. So as we look at this, the disciples, they're being very pragmatic. They're being very reasonable in this. They're looking at thousands of people that were there, and they're thinking, that's a lot of mouths to feed, Jesus. So they take note of the fact that they've been there all day long and they had had nothing to eat. Plus, there's nowhere close by for them to go for food. Again, and it's very clear that as the writers put this down, that they say this is a deserted place. There's nowhere around. So that's a problem. Now, one of the disciples, the apostles, a guy named Philip, he was the analytical thinker in the bunch. And if you study out his life, you see that he's very analytical. Whenever he comes into the picture, and here it's like if there were calculators, he'd have had his out. Because he's doing the math and it's not adding up. So in John chapter 6, verse 7, we see Philip, he's schooling Jesus now. He's letting Jesus know how this isn't going to work. He says there, as Philip answered him, said 200 denarii, 200 days' wages, Jesus. worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. So the logical thing to do would be to send the crowd away so they could go and buy their own food with their own money. That's a reasonable request. This isn't far-fetched. These guys are not being faithless. They just don't see what's going on yet. Watch what happens in verse 16, though. This is where Jesus changes it up on them. It says in verse 16, but Jesus said to them, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Now, imagine if you're one of these guys and you hear him say that to you. You give them something to eat, and you've got this mass of people standing there looking hungry. It would definitely not be what you'd expect to come out of his mouth. But Jesus was always doing that with his guys. They never knew what was coming out of his mouth next. Thousands of people there in this deserted place. And Jesus says, guys, you don't need to go. They don't need to go anywhere. You feed them. It's at this point, John's gospel gives us some insight, an extremely important principle that has direct application to their lives as well as ours. In John chapter 6, verse 6, we read, but this he said to test them, for he himself knew what he would do. Fascinating. You see, Jesus had a very powerful lesson to teach these men, and by extension, it's a very powerful lesson for each of us who follow him as well. Folks, we got to understand that here, the people, they're hungry. They have a legitimate need. We also see Jesus' disciples have a legitimate question. How are all these people going to eat? So the people have no idea what's going on. Jesus' disciples have no idea what's going on. However, we're told here that Jesus himself knew what he would do before he did it. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 says this. It says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Now, the point here is nobody could see what Jesus was about to do. Not the people and not the disciples. However, Jesus did ahead of time. Keep that in mind. It's an important lesson that they were going to learn. Important lesson for us as well. So Jesus turns to them and says, you give them something to eat. So, and folks, how often are we faced with circumstances or situations in which we have no answers? We look around, we conclude there's no way out. This is it. We're going down with the ship or whatever it is. In human terms, those are legitimate concerns that come to us all the time. It's in these times that we got to understand, though, that Jesus himself knows what he's going to do. We don't see it, he does. We see here that he's moved with compassion, even knowing the people's hearts weren't right. Even so. Now, I'd love to, and I take encouragement from that, because I would love to tell you that every time I'm faced with a situation or a circumstance that is overwhelming in some way or another, I'd love to tell you that I always respond in some high spiritual way and that, man, I just go right to perfect faith and all of that. That's not reality, is it? Not for me. I don't know about you, but what I need to remember in those moments is that even if the math isn't working out, even if there doesn't appear to be any answers in human terms, even if every avenue of escape seems to be blocked, Jesus already knows what he's going to do. We've got to learn. I'll tell you what, that is the essence of what it is to learn to trust God. Verse 17. And they said to him, we have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, once again, in blending these gospel accounts, the question becomes, where did these 5 loaves and 2 fish come from? Matthew doesn't tell us, but in John's gospel, he says that right after Philip tells them there's no way that they have enough money to buy food, another of his apostles, his disciples, Andrew, steps up, and he has this to say in John chapter 6, verse 8. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, There's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many? So by the way, the loaves here, we're not talking about Wonder Bread, okay? This is not loaves like we look at, like we see in the supermarket. These are little flat pieces of bread. It'd be more like pita bread or a pancake or something along those lines. This is flatbread. This is not loaves like we would look at them in our culture. So think of in terms of a pancake. That's the barley loaf pictured here. 5 barley loaves, if you will, flatbread, and 2 small fish. Now, we're not given much detail either about the little boy here. He would have been standing close to the disciples for him to even come into the picture. We don't know if he volunteered to give up his lunch or not. It doesn't tell us. I would love to think that he did, and it makes sense, because think about little children. You overhear a grown-up conversation. They're saying, we don't have any food. How are these people going to eat? And I picture this little kid saying, I've got mine. Will this help? I mean, you can see it in your mind, just the innocence of a child coming and saying, take this. You can use this. The faith of a child. We don't know how it happened. Certainly, what they found was not much at all. Remember, 5,000 people, not including women and children. So we have 5 small pieces of bread, similar to flatbread, and a couple of small fish, likely sardines or tilapia. Both of those are lake fish that are common to the Sea of Galilee. And there's this little boy. He's got this humble meal, maybe a couple sardines in his lunch, and that's what Andrew uses. Andrew's not looking at this kid as a resource. He's not saying, oh, here's a kid with he's got a couple of pieces of fish and a few pieces of bread. He's not doing that. He's saying, we have an impossible situation on our hands. This is all the food I see. In other words, this is hopeless. There's nothing going on here. So that's their predicament. Verse 18, and he is speaking of Jesus here, and Jesus said, bring them here to me. Now, you got to catch the scene, folks. I'm a visual person, and I just see this in my mind's eye. And when Jesus says this, I picture his men are shocked. They're like, what? What are you talking about? And first they look at him, and they look at each other, and they look at this little kid, and they're thinking, what on earth is he going, what's going on here? Why? Because this is an impossible situation for them. I mean, we read that, we know the end from the beginning. We know he feeds everybody. They didn't. They're living this out, and they're like scratching their heads big time, like, what is he getting at? Now, remember too, this is interesting. These guys had been with Jesus for over 2 years. They'd seen him change water into wine. They'd seen him raise the dead. How many miracles had Jesus done that they had witnessed firsthand? Hundreds and hundreds. We're told that lines of people would come and he would heal each one. These things should have led them to realize that nothing was impossible for Jesus. Remember also, they had just returned from being out on their own, on this solo mission that they'd just come back from. We're told that through them that they were casting out demons. They were healing the sick. They understood that, though, that was God's power working through them. So they had seen what Jesus had done. They had experienced firsthand his mighty power. And yet, even though he had empowered them in their own lives to do things they couldn't possibly do on their own, here they are, staring at Jesus, wondering what he's going to do next. Folks, there's a vital lesson in this for you and me. If you're a Christian, just the fact that you have responded to the gospel of Christ is in itself an absolute miracle. How many times have you been in a place where you see God move in some supernatural way, or perhaps in some miraculous thing, or even in subtle ways, such as an answer to prayer, or having peace in the middle of a storm, in the middle of a trial. And yet, just like these disciples, at times things hit us. Because we don't initially see what God is doing, the stress, the panic soon follows. Perhaps you're dealing with something this morning and you're in that place. If you're not, I guarantee you that at some point you will be. All of us go through things. So I want to give you some advice. When whatever that thing is comes up, you feel the stress beginning to rise, and you know what I'm talking about. Start wringing your hands, start white-knuckling, whatever it is. I want you to think about God's past faithfulness in your life. It's a good practice to be in. Think about how he's come through, or how he's shown himself strong on your behalf in some way, in the things that you've dealt with previously. The point is, use God's past faithfulness as a down payment on the fact that he indeed will be faithful even if. Even though you don't see the outcome presently, understand that he does, and he will come through. These men are learning reliance upon Jesus. They're learning to look beyond the natural. And I believe that Jesus would have loved to hear them say something like, Lord, you've told us you want us to feed everybody here. So we're going to acknowledge that we're not capable of doing so because we've got nothing. We don't see how, but what we do know is that nothing is impossible for you. And folks, that's the lesson for us. That would be an attitude of faith, born of looking at his past faithfulness, to see presently based upon past experience. Because what he does, he matures us through the heat of a crisis. Instead of coming apart, there is a resting in him as we, like they, are learning to trust. And that's the point. Verse 19. Then he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitudes. So Luke's account tells us that Jesus instructed his disciples to sit down in crowds of 50, groups of 50. So as we see here, Jesus gave thanks to the Father, and that would have been a typical Jewish prayer. The one in their day would be something like, blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, who gives us the bread from the earth, something along those lines. They had scripted Jewish prayers in his day, as they do today. So it would be something like that. So then he looks up, he blesses the bread, and he broke it and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples to the multitudes. Now, there's interesting language here in the original. When he broke the bread, what it indicates is that he broke it and he kept on breaking it. This is a continual tense here. So as fast as he's breaking the loaves, they're growing back in his hands. And we don't know if that happened literally in his hands, or if it happened, they're going to see in a second, they have baskets, and the baskets just kept filling from the bottom up. We don't know exactly how the miracle happened, but we do believe that it happened. I mean, Jesus did this amazing thing. So the question is, here, thinking about this, what would be more difficult? To set the universe in order, or to make fish and bread out of nothing? Folks, this is creation. This is the creator of the universe at work here. Interesting. As he's breaking the loaves, breaking the fishes, they're multiplying as he goes. Verse 20, so they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments that remained. So it says here that the multitudes were filled. Now the word there, it literally means that they were glutted. In other words, I can't eat another bite. Now many of us have just come off of Thanksgiving dinner, and we know what that feels like. It's like, oh, no, I don't want anything. I'll push that stuff away. That's what they're doing here. And that's significant for these people who lived on daily sustenance. I mean, they ate what they farmed, essentially, or what they could gather. That's very significant. They ate until they couldn't eat anymore. Thinking about this is like, did they have seconds? Did they have thirds? What did they do? For these people, being glutted was saying something. All four accounts record for us that Jesus broke the loaves and the fish and gave it to the disciples. And there we see that the disciples had 12 baskets of leftovers. Fascinating. So God, you got to understand this, and again, it tells us something about God. And there are different commentators have different. Some of them are pretty far-fetched about what do the baskets mean, and that means this and that, and it's like, no, you know what? I think I understand what it's meaning. There's a rule of Bible interpretation: when in doubt, go with the simplest possible explanation. They had leftovers because He wanted to give them more than they needed. He doesn't just give us enough. He blesses us. Paul in Ephesians chapter 3, he talks about God blessing us exceedingly abundantly above all that we could ask or think. So these baskets, they're not getting empty of bread and fish as they go. The food it seems to be being created as fast as anyone took a handful. Now, I'm going to invite you to put yourself into the picture here. Imagine for a moment that you're out there, and what in the world you'd be thinking, what's going on here? As one of His disciples, first of all, you're thinking, okay, I'm going out with this basket full of fish and bread, trying to process all of this. You would still be spinning because this stuff's unfolding. Again, you didn't get up that morning thinking this is going to be happening. And so you're trying to process all of it and saying, asking yourself, how did this come about? What's going on here? I don't get what's going on and how things are coming about. I saw this little boy. He didn't have very much, just a small lunch. How is it that I have this basket? Maybe you look ahead and you're thinking, looking at the first group, thinking, okay, there's 50 people sitting there in this group, and I've got this basket. I don't think that's going to be enough to feed 50 people. So am I going to be making a whole bunch of trips back and forth? Am I going to be running the rest of the afternoon? I don't know. Perhaps I'm doing the math, trying to figure out how many times I got to walk back to get more from Jesus as I work my way through the crowds. Maybe I'm wanting to conserve, and I'm telling everybody that I bring my basket to, only take one. Just take one. We want to make the stretch. But as I go along, I look at the basket, it's still full. So now, seeing that it's replenishing as I go, and it's never empty, now I start telling everybody, take everything you want. Take all, here, no, take some more. Here, take this. And perhaps, again, there's so much that goes on between the lines in these things, and I always want to be careful not to read into things and to spiritualize passages, but you've got to realize that there have got to be some things that are going on, at least in the expressions between these guys. Perhaps they look up at Jesus and He just kind of nods and gives them a knowing smile, like, keep going, or whatever it is. This is an amazing scene. I also want to point out that while these men couldn't understand what Jesus was doing in that moment, they were faithful. They were obedient. They did exactly as the Lord asked them to do. And that's important. Am I going to limit my obedience to only when I understand what God is compelling me to do? That can be a tough thing because He's always stretching us. He's always causing us to come to places of further trust. He's always causing us to come to places of walking by faith and not by sight. That's exactly what He's doing with these guys. And they get in line with what He's doing. They experienced the same blessings as everybody else did. As we see here in verse 20, everyone ate, everyone was filled. Matthew adds this in verse 21. He says, now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men besides women and children. Now, understand, in first century Galilee, they lived in a patriarchal society. In other words, they measured attendance by the number of men. Now, we don't do that in our day. I'm not going to make some misogynistic beef about that. That's just what they did. The point is, we can conservatively estimate if it was a husband, if it was a man, and they have wives, and 2 to 4 kids would give way over 15,000 people. Conservative estimates, 10 to 15,000 people, probably more, probably north of that, are all there at this all-you-can-eat dinner. They had everything they possibly wanted, and then there was more. It's also worth mentioning that as we wrap up, looking at this, think about that little boy. I'll bet he had story to tell for the rest of his life about what Jesus did with that meager lunch that he had. So I also want to emphasize a couple of things as we conclude. So first of all, I'm going to look at what God can do with a little. And that's significant here. It begins by putting whatever you have, whatever you're dealing with, in the Lord's hands. And that brings us to another point of application. We read in Romans chapter 8, verse 32, the Apostle Paul writing there, he says, "He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things?" Think about the boy's mother. She's packing his lunch that day, that morning. She could have no idea that that little lunch that she's packing for her boy was going to feed 15,000 people. What made the difference? Jesus' hands made the difference. Take a little, put it in Jesus' hands, and you end up with a lot. I call that kingdom mathematics. Looking at this story, 5 plus 2 equals not much. 5 plus 2 plus Jesus equals blessing beyond measure. And folks, we can easily slip into, because we're pragmatic, we have reasons for the things we do and say and observe and all of that, we can slip into that faithless place of thinking that we have so little to offer, or thinking that what could God do with me? What could I possibly give you, Lord, that's of value? In my own strength, in my own understanding, in my own resources, probably not much. And yet, that doesn't matter to him. The Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians 4:7, what do you have that you did not receive? As an act of trusting God, whatever you have that he's giving you as a gift, give it back to him. Entrust it to him. At many junctures in my relationship with the Lord over the years, I have taken that thing and I've said, Lord, I'm putting that on the altar. You do with it as you will. And I've been absolutely amazed and blessed at what he does. As we see with Jesus' men, we watch what he does with what you couldn't possibly have done on your own. It'll be a blessing to you. Secondly, this is important. When we combine all 4 of these accounts together on the same day, Jesus taught them, he healed them, and he fed them. Throughout that day, he patiently loved them, cared for them. But remember, his miracles are never an end unto themselves. That's very important to understand. This is not standalone. Again, it's why we go through laying the groundwork for this, and what he does after this is very significant. And you'll have to wait for the next study for that. But truly, there was always a reason for the miracles that Jesus did. They pointed to something greater. And in John's account, he leads us to what followed this miracle. On the very next day, Jesus gives the spiritual application and the importance of the miracle that he had done. In John chapter 6, verse 35, we read there, "And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst." Folks, physical food is one thing. Obviously, it's necessary in order to survive. That's a given. In that, The people here were excited because Jesus had fed them, and they didn't have a lot of food. In a sense, feeding the 5,000, it's a living parable. Remember, parables are stories that lay down alongside a spiritual reality. We've looked at those when we looked at the kingdom parables in the last chapter. However, Jesus doesn't just give us bread, that nourishment which is necessary to sustain us physically. He is bread, the very bread of life. It's about trusting Christ, and in so doing, finding sustenance for your soul. That comes by one decision and many decisions. I'll explain. If you've never made that one decision to follow Christ, let today be the day. I'm speaking to people either in this room or people watching online. Turn from that old self-propelled life to Christ. Embrace Jesus. If you already belong to Christ, draw upon the nourishment that he gives in whatever circumstance, in whatever situation that you're in. Whenever something hits us, whenever circumstances overwhelm or stress you out or stress me out, realize that Jesus already knows what he wants to do in it, what he wants to do in our lives. Whether it's a trial that we face or a blessing to behold, he invites us to place those things in his loving hands. As we do, we learn to trust that his plan will be revealed in his time, as he gently, compassionately works in and through whatever that thing is, for our good, for our growth, and for our blessing. Let's pray. Father, as we go through this passage, what a rich passage it is. Lord, I just pray for each one here, Lord, each one within the sound of my voice, that you would just do a powerful work as you speak to us, as we come away from this place with the willingness and the desire to apply your word to our lives personally. Lord, teach us to trust. Teach us to be people who are reliant upon you, especially when we don't understand the circumstances, especially when we don't see the end of whatever it is we're dealing with. Lord, teach us to trust that you do, and that we rely upon you, and that we draw close to you, knowing that you are filled with compassion towards us, even when we have it wrong. You're compassionate, you're merciful, you're kind, you're loving. So, Father, thank you for this passage, this beautiful passage. As we look at it, I pray, Father, for each one here, that as we go out of here today and as we go into the week ahead, that you would bring to our remembrance the things that you would have us to take home and to take to heart personally. We give all of it to you, Lord. We thank you for your word, and we thank you for this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.